Scott comes and speaks. We have a parent and baby room just over to my right. It's a long room in there. If you feel you need to go out with your child, it's unsupervised, but there is a space out there for the young kiddies to run around. If you want to get clued in, it's the wrong word, if you want to get some more information about our church family, Holy Trinity, we have Connect cards that has a space in the back for your name, email address and phone number, and we can then send you out our weekly newsletter and you can find out some more about what's happening in our church family. So those little leaflets are all available outside at the back. And every Sunday we collect some money. Giving is a big part of our church family, and some people give online. We have also these QR codes that you can give with your phone. But if you would please read the following with me, just as the collectors come round to the baskets. Thank you. We just have a short prayer. And if you could say this with me. Lord, everything we have comes from you, so we respond in worship by giving these gifts and our lives back to you for the glory of your name. Amen. So thank you for your generosity, whether you give online or whether you give personally on a Sunday. It goes towards the different ministries that we have here in the church and helps us function. So before Scott comes, if you want to say hello to somebody. The picnic? Yes. The picnic, is there a slide there for the picnic? So again, if you didn't hear me earlier on, we're having a picnic after the service rather than tea and coffee. We're all going across to the Church of Ireland grounds, which is about a 5-minute walk from here. And Chloe up the front here, and Zoe is somewhere, yes, in the white t-shirt. They're leading today. So hopefully it's not going to rain, is it? No, it never rains in Ireland, so it might be a little chilly, but it's not going to rain. So you're very welcome to join us for a couple of hours over there. Kids, adults, everyone. Okay, Scott, are you happy to come?
Okay, I think I'm on my mic here, am I? Yeah, thanks, Damon. All good. Getting my notes here. So yeah, good to see you all coming out on another summer's day here. So we're going to do a kind of sermon series over the summer. We're looking at following the lectionary of the Old Testament readings, which are all based in Genesis, and we're going to be looking at the different kind of characters in the Bible. It's from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rebecca. Getting the woman in there, it's good, and Joseph as well, which is cool because we're going to be doing the same passages in the 10 o'clock service as well as the 11:30 as well. But yeah, today's scripture is a toughie, I'm not going to lie. It's not exactly kid-friendly, and yet we have the kids in. So let's get started with it. So it's in Genesis chapter 22. Hopefully this will work now. I haven't... Sorry, is there a button to press? Yeah. It might be. No. Is it plugged in there? You can do it? Yeah, okay. We'll get the passage up anyway. Genesis chapter 22. Are you ready there? Yeah. Okay. After these things, God tested Abram. He said to him, Abram. And he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. So Abram rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He didn't tell Sarah, I noticed, anyway. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abram looked up and saw the place far away. Next slide. Then Abram said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abram took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it out on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abram, said to his father Abram, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abram said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abram built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Next slide. Then Abram reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything for him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abram looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abram went out and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abram called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it said this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Thanks, God. So yeah, it's not exactly kid-friendly, is it, the story? It's not exactly seeker-friendly. It's not exactly kind of, I suppose, young faith-friendly either. And in some ways, this passage can be that, I think it was Christopher Hitchens wrote that book, God is Not Good and God's Not Great. And this is perfect material for that, is how could God be great when he seemed to have to test Abraham because he didn't know himself? And how could God be good to put such torture on Abraham for 3 days? Fair enough points, I suppose. I want to just give some context, I think, while we're looking at this whole idea of sacrifice. In a way, sacrifice is an amazing human invention, that you give up something good in the present for the hope of something better in the future. And you could kind of see that in our lives. Many of us might have had kids who've done the junior cert and leaving cert. They gave up, or they should have given up, fun things, fun times on their phone for the future benefit of good results. We know that. That's really what work is, isn't it? We give up things we want to do for the future of benefit. And you can imagine the early civilizations started to realize this. We could give up some of our food, some of our seed, and plant it in the ground for the hope of better future of crops. And so probably bit by bit, the civilizations during this Mesopotamia area would have kind of figured this idea of sacrifice. This is kind of an amazing idea. And they probably became more self-conscious of time as well and be able to put in the future. It's funny now, we're kind of the opposite. We buy now and pay later, isn't it? We're kind of doing the opposite. But, and you can imagine then they're sort of like, well, the more we give up, we seem to get more back. The more crops we give, we seem to get stuff out. But then they have the sense that the gods out there are pretty angry because there's a lot of chaos that happens. So maybe if we give the most important things, maybe the gods won't be angry. So maybe if we give up life itself, so not only would we give up all our animals, all our important things to the gods, maybe if we give up our sons or daughters to child sacrifice, maybe then God would come back and help us. And, you know, commentaries and archaeologists would have seen different groups, like the Canaanites would have done this, the Aztecs would have done this. There was that mad movie, Mel Gibson, wasn't it, when they were out in the Amazon, and mad stuff like that in the days. So when Abram heard this, I'm sure obviously he was disturbed, but it wouldn't have been completely out of his cultural context. This is what a lot of the nations were doing, a lot of the civilizations were doing. But the other really one I wanted to talk about is really, the other context is his faith journey. So probably, I've got a few favorites of the Bible. I love the Gospel of John. I like Luke as well. I love Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, some Psalms, and I love this section as well of Abraham's life from chapter 12 to 25, because you get this opportunity of journeying with this person through the ups and downs of faith. And we're in chapter 22, so we're at the very end, really, of his story, just like what Gordon opened with this morning about this idea of knowing God's faithful if we've gone through journey after journey. So we're meeting Abraham at the kind of end of his life. This call that God has told him to go up to the mountain and sacrifice his son. He has had other calls. He's had other experiences of God coming through. He's had seen miracles that have gone beyond logic. He has had his wife Sarah, who's 90, from barrenness, from death, to bring life. He's already seen a miracle of death before life. Fair play to Sarah and fair play to Abraham. And the Hebrews writer says this. He says, by faith in Hebrews 11, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him and offered Isaac as a sacrifice, he who had embraced the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. See, Abram reasoned that God could even raise the dead. So in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. So there's something about, yes, I'm sure when we don't minimize the anguish and the tension of that 3-day hike, wrestling with God, it's so important. But we also want to know that there's something about Abram's faith that knew this doesn't really make sense. This whole purpose was God was going to call me to be a father of nations. So God will probably find a way through this as well. There was a story, and written by Nikos Kazantzakis, the famous Greek writer, apparently. I'm trying to be all cultural, but I heard this story in his memoir. I think he was the guy that probably had most. He needed a Nobel Prize or book of literature, but never won one. I think he probably had 9 of them. Zorbo the Great and some of these things. But amazing kind of writer. But he had in his memoir, he told us the story of himself. Wanted to go on a spiritual pilgrimage. And he was from Greece, obviously with a name like that. And he's going to the Greek Orthodox monks' monasteries. And he met this monk. He was just curious about how he's going. He said, "Monk, Father, do you still wrestle with the devil? Do you still, work through your sin? Are you still struggling with things, the devil's temptations?" And the old monk, you can imagine this kind of old Greek monk, weathered through life, says, "I don't know. I'm too tired to wrestle with the devil. And I think the devil's too tired wrestling with me. And we kind of leave each other alone." And the young Kazantzakis, Nikos, was like, "Wow, that's great. Your faith must be really good now. You don't have any wrestling with the devil and no wrestling with temptation." "Oh no," he says, it gets even worse. I now wrestle with God. And there's this idea as we grow in faith, as Abram wrestled at the start of his life, of this calling out of security and his own insecurities and his own sense of identity, moving family, that was a part of his journey, part of his faith. But now he's getting to this point of his faith where it's going even deeper, that he now is wrestling with God. I'm being very ecumenical now, from Greek Orthodox to Catholic, I think. Roland Rolheiser, great spiritual writer, talks about these stages of faith. He says the first stage in our lives of faith is to get our lives together. We know this even as teenagers, coming into puberty. Our whole idea is to sort of leave home, a lot of them don't leave home till their 20s or 30s, but even metaphorically leaving home, leaving their identity. And a lot of their struggles is just, how do I get my life together? How do I control my energies in right ways? Loads of impulses, loads of emotions, loads of energy. How do I manage that? And I think the real archetype of that is the prodigal son in the prodigal story, the son that just wanted everything now, and boom, 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 his struggle, his faith. And that was just like Abram's faith as well. How do I manage this first part of my story? I think some people, even if they're in their 40s, 50s, don't quite move on to the next stage, is how do I give our lives away? That's the next struggle. Sometimes life comes at you, it's like, oh, now I have kids to look after. I have to give my life to kids. How do I really give my life away to my community, to my church, to my work? It's no longer about kind of impulses, but you can sometimes see that in the midlife crisis. It's like, no, I don't want to go there. I still want to just have my toys and drive my convertible. But sometimes the struggle is no longer about laziness and impulsivity. Sometimes it's more about our struggle of being a workaholic. Or our struggle is no longer about being indulgent, but struggle is about our cynicism or our resentments. And how do we just give our lives away? And we begin to see that in Abram's life when he journeyed. He did a lot. Lot was with him, his nephew, and his Lot's crew and Abram's crew were fighting over the best land. And Abram just said, "Lot, you got to take the good land." He started to lose his ego. You take the good land. Then when Abram doing what he shouldn't do, Lot doing what he shouldn't do, hanging out in Sodom and Gomorrah, it was Abram who gave himself away, praying to God, interceding for him. And it was Abram who went after with a group of warriors to risk his life to save Lot as well. So this beginning to journey it. And then Rolheiser says we get this last step. Then our struggle is to give our debts away. It's how we do our legacy. And we probably know people in our lives who have had good debts. They let go of the bitterness, let go of the peace, and have a peaceful. We have other people that are angry and frustrated and bitter as well. And so the common theme through all this journeying of Abraham, all this journey of faith for all of us, is the idea of worship. And we see here in the passage, this is the first time that worship is mentioned in the whole Bible. Then Abram said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship. That's interesting. Then we will come back to you." So yeah, worship is not fundamentally singing a song, but it's incredible technology, songs and singing. I remember they're talking about that, how music is the vehicle, but it's more like a learned disposition towards what we think is our foundation to living a good life. So what we worship, what is that thing that I have to be happy? And that's really what worship is. Abraham's great love was his son Isaac, not only because it was his son Isaac, but it was the representative of all of his faith. It was the accumulation of everything. It's like an entrepreneur who created this business. They often say, "That's my baby, isn't it? This is my business." The church leader who founded a church and grew it. All this. So it was everything that Isaac was. It was the kind of, it was like, this is the example of God's faithfulness. And God tested Abraham. Abraham was tested because God says, really, do you love Abraham, Isaac, more than me? Do you love the promises that I've given you? Do you love those promises more than me, the one who gave the promise? Do you love the call, this exciting call that I was going to make you great and be a blessing? Do you love that more than me, the caller? Do you love me, the giver, or do you just love the gift? What a test. Nearly as hard as the maths test in the Leaving Cert, wasn't it? And so the test is, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him to me as a burnt offering. Wow. And Abram did that. You see, another way of looking at it is that young faith, we can kind of hold things too loosely, the good things of life. See, the test wasn't, Abram, do the good thing or the wrong thing. The test was, Abram, the good things, have you turned into God things? It's a more subtle test, more deeper test. And when we get good things in our lives, how do we hold them? Usually, a immature person, young person, we hold them loosely. I don't know about you guys, when I reflect back to all that time I had in my 20s, I wasted a lot of that time doing nonsense, playing FIFA on the PlayStation to, I don't know what I did. And I think that is a young faith. We kind of don't hold things well enough. I remember on my social work placement and staying up nearly all night the night before because I had a lack of kind of holding things respectfully, and I was in this really important social work meeting and I fell asleep. I almost didn't pass my test. It was terrible. And we see that. We don't often, young people and moving into kind of maturing faith, we have to learn what reverence is, what it means to hold things well. But then a new struggle is in our older faith. We can hold things too tightly. So as well as me staying up late and not holding work respectfully, I can end up holding work too tightly. And by holding it too tightly, I begin to crush it, crush me, and crush all the people around me. I was talking to a friend of mine the other night, Friday night, and he's like an executive coach, so he works with pretty high-level managers and stuff all over the world, from executives to Lego to all sorts of places. He was saying to me, this is a concept they use in that business, it's the 80% concept, which is like, you shouldn't be operating at 100% of your capacity, because if you do that for too long, it becomes unsustainable and you burn out. So you almost have to operate at an 80% concept. But so many of us in our lives hold things too tightly. Parents can hold their children so tightly, either by, I don't let them go, so I'm going to overindulge them, or I'm going to hold them so tight, I'm going to discipline them, make sure they're really good. We hold them so tightly, we can lose them. So good things, we can either hold them too loosely or too tightly. Because Abraham passed the test, because God said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son. You haven't held your son so tightly from me. Having God first in our life, seek first the kingdom of God and all the other things. So if we hold work well, not loosely, not tightly, if we hold it well, and God will give us the balance for that, we'll do well in work. If we hold our children not loosely, not tightly, we will have our children. And then this lovely phrase, the Lord will provide. And really the start of this, because Genesis is obviously origins, it's beginnings of things. So this beginning of this sort of sacrifice sort of begins to kick off in the Jewish culture. what I call a transactional sacrifice. We give God something of us that's important. And I think it was really it was more about a heart thing. It was about making sure we didn't put other things as idols. So even our first fruits, the things of wealth, food was probably the most important thing. We would give it to God in a sacrifice. But we'd get something in return. We'd get God's forgiveness. So it was a kind of transactional sacrifice. But as we went through the story of Israel, there were kind of senses this is not quite the real thing. It's something just a bit off sort of this transactional sacrifice thing. And we see the prophets beginning to wonder about that. So that's the passage there. It says in Micah's just asking all these questions, really good questions. He's kind of reflecting on hundreds of years of sacrificing of lambs to God. He says, with what shall I come before the Lord or bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Or shall I even give my firstborn for my transgression? Like God was tested Abram, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. Great questions. He's beginning to question. There's something different here. We need to think of something else. But he's told us, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require to you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So yeah, this kind of idea of transactional sacrifice, it is about earning God's forgiveness. We do something to get God to forgive us. And the Hebrew writer, again, kind of reflects on this in the Message translation or interpretation. He says this, the old plan was only a hint of good things in the new plan. Since the old law plan wasn't complete in itself, it couldn't complete those who followed it. No matter how many sacrifices were offered, year after year, they never added up to a complete solution. Then Christ made a single sacrifice for sins, and that was it. Once sins are taken care of for good, there's no longer any need to offer sacrifices for them. So this constant need to try and earn God's forgiveness and love through dutiful going to church, doing good things, or religious sacrifice, if we can still have this mentality, if I do this, then God will do this. And we're doing all these things and God's not coming through. We can a life of bitterness, a life of frustration, or a life of spiritual burnout. But then Jesus says, look, this sort of transactional sacrifice on the cross, he says, look, this is the last time we need to do this. It's finished. You don't need to keep doing this. It is finished. And so we move into a different type of sacrifice, which I kind of call relational sacrifice. So we receive in God's forgiveness and grace. We don't have to do anything. And from that, then we get this life of Abram, that we can lead a life of adventure, of excitement, and of challenge, just like the passage we've heard today. And so then, this is how it kind of interprets the letter to the Romans. Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, on the basis of God's mercy, not on the basis of your sacrifice, not on the basis of what you give, on the basis of God's mercy, not on the basis of transactional sacrifice, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable act of worship. And this is how do we do worship? How we go deeper, like Abram's faiths go deep. We go deeper so we don't conform to this age, this cultural ideas of I want all the stuff, I want all the toys, the unwillingness to give of ourselves, unwillingness to have struggle through things that are important. We live a superficial consumer kind of lifestyle. No, our worship is not to be conformed to these things, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, getting a new perspective of what it means to follow God, what it means to worship him, so that you may discern the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So, living a life of sacrifice and also holding things lightly, not loosely, not tightly, the good and precious things in our lives. How do we do that? Well, God gave the reason. He said, and we see it there, I know that you fear God. So it's like God says, I see you passed the test, and I've also seen how you've passed the test, is that you fear me. Or in the Romans letter, you've viewed God's mercies. And the late Timothy Keller has a great kind of passage, a quote really, on what the fear of God is. And I'll read it out here, and you can read it. Obviously, to be in the fear of the Lord is not to be scared of the Lord, even though the Hebrew word has overtones of respect and awe. Fear in the Bible means to be overwhelmed to be controlled by something. To fear the Lord is to be overwhelmed with wonder before the greatness of God and his love. It means that because of his bright holiness and magnificent love, you find him fearfully beautiful. That is why why the more we experience God's grace and God's forgiveness, the more we experience a trembling awe and wonder before the greatness of all that he is and has done for us. Fearing him means bowing before him out of amazement at his glory and beauty. In a way, fearing God is kind of like it rearranges our lives. It orders our loves and allows us a settled, balanced way of doing life. Because God is the only one that can worship. God is the one, if we worship him, he doesn't crush us. He doesn't force us into slavery, but he forces us into freedom. So, Abraham, and we're going to be learning a lot more of the other guys, Isaac, Jacob, Rebekah, Joseph, in the coming weeks. But Abraham is an incredible example of an imperfect human that follows God to an ever deeper faith. And that's something for all of us to think about, isn't it? Where is he leading us? What struggles is he leading us? Maybe we're still wrestling with the devil, but maybe we're also wrestling with God, and that's okay. But he's also it is a great foreshadowing of God's ultimate provision, that we no longer have to try and buy God's grace with sacrifice. Invite the band up, and let's pray. I invite you guys to stand if you're okay.